Welcome to Fantasy Football Today. I'm Jamie Eisenberg. That's Dave Richard. That's Heath Cummings. Hope you guys all had a happy Thanksgiving. As you can see here, once again, our compadre Adam Azer is not with us. He's traveling back home after spending a few days with us in South Florida. It was fun to see him. Dave, I'm sure you had a good time hanging out with him in the studio.
Sure.
And this show is brought to you by BetMGM, the sportsbook born in Vegas. How was your Thanksgiving, guys?
Oh, awesome. And as I was sitting at the Thanksgiving table with my parents, my in-laws, my wife, my kids, I was thinking to myself, which one of these side dishes is worse than rolls? And the answer is none. So that the fact is that we had a great time. Karen hit it out of the park with a homemade Thanksgiving. That's how I like it. And it was a really great time. And the best part, my wife, does she know football or what? As soon as there was kickoff in the Giants-Cowboys game, the turkey was on the table.
Fantastic day as well. Very thankful. The only negative is that I think I woke up full, which is not a great feeling. Like you'd like to wake up kind of like the food's all gone and digested. It's my belly's still full. I ate way too much.
Oh, you woke up today full. Good. I hope you didn't wake up yesterday full. Yeah. I had a nice Thanksgiving as well. Hope everybody that's watching and listening to us did also, and hopefully you enjoyed the games. We have a lot to get to today as we finish up the Week 13 slate, but we have 3 games to cover. We'll give you the latest update on the Chiefs and the Raiders, which kick off later today at 3 o'clock Eastern, and a lot of news to get to as well. So let's start with the games from yesterday. We'll start with the from the Bears' perspective, at least, the disaster in Detroit. Lions beat the Bears 23-20. It was a very interesting back and forth game. First half, very much in favor of the Lions. Second half, very much in favor of Chicago. I'm gonna ask you guys just so we can get through this a little quickly. So one of you will each take one side of the ledger here. So Dave, I'll give you the Chicago side. What did you first of all, what do you think about the ending? And Keith, if you want to give your 2 cents on that one also. What do you think about the ending with what Matt Eberflus did? And then just Dave, your take on the Bears, how they performed against Detroit.
So I'm a Chicago White Sox fan, and I watched this baseball season as the White Sox found creative and exciting ways to blow leads and lose games, and they went on to have the worst record in Major League Baseball history. This game and kind of the last month for the Bears has kind of been the exact same thing. They find creative ways to lose. This was the latest. As I told my family as we were watching the game, including my father, who's still a Bears fan, the conspiracy theorist in me thinks that Eberflus blew this on purpose because he knew that the Bears weren't going anywhere and it's just going to help them get a higher draft pick. So why win the game? But the players would obviously be against that. And it's really not what happened. What really happened is either some sort of terrible miscommunication between the coach and the quarterback. And it led to them having to throw into the end zone. But yes, total botch job. Honestly, I feel like the Bears were completely dead in the water going into the game until the Lions started to incur injuries on defense. And once they lost like 3 defensive linemen and linebacker Malcolm Rodriguez. And when they all left the game, that's when Chicago really started to get going. Caleb played well. Just imagine how good Caleb Williams will be, Jamie, when he's got good coaching. And now we've seen the last couple of games, we've seen him with good coordinating. I would feel good about him if I were a Bears fan, and as a fantasy manager, I would have to start considering him as a borderline number 1 fantasy quarterback and someone who's probably a little bit better than Andy Dalton the rest of season.
I thought it was a completely this was the Caleb Williams experience. Awful bad in the first half. Couldn't hardly throw a ball within 3 feet of a wide receiver. Showed us all of the upside for a majority of the second half. And it's Eberflus's fault. He's got to go. 100% agree. But a starting quarterback in the NFL, even if you were a rookie, has to handle those last 32 seconds better. Caleb takes really bad sacks and really didn't handle that well. And I'm still really uncertain whether he's going to be a good fantasy quarterback one day. I don't know if he's ever going to be like a playoff quarterback.
I do wonder what they'll do from a coaching perspective, because you will now be giving him, if they fire everybody, which would make sense, 3 offense coordinators in a year. So if they fire Thomas Brown also. So you wonder if they maybe try and find somebody who would keep Thomas Brown if they bring in a defensive head coach. That's certainly something that we've seen in the past. He has played better with Thomas Brown, 2 games in his last 3 with Brown calling plays. 30.9 fantasy points. So yes, he has struggled, as Heath pointed out, taking some bad sacks, took one at the end of the game there. But from a production standpoint, we love what we've seen from him. They do get San Francisco next week, then Minnesota again, and Detroit again, 2 teams that he's faced in each of the last 2 games where he's had some success. Just quickly on the receivers, I don't think we're going to have a lot of confidence in DeAndre Swift moving forward because he scored 9.5 PPR points or less in 3 of his last 4 games.
Right. And not with that schedule.
Not with that schedule. Is DJ Moore and I guess more importantly, Keenan Allen now must start fantasy receivers. Allen, 2 games in a row with 23.6 PPR points, gave us a little scare with his injury, came back in and was fine. And Moore, 2 games in a row with 13.7. Sorry, 3 games in a row with 13.7 PPR points. Back-to-back games with 23.7 PPR points. Just yes or no? Must start receivers rest of the way?
Yes.
Mostly yes.
Yes, week 14.
Yes, week 14. So if they come out of that game with another good performance and we have 6 teams on a bye next week, you might feel very confident about the Bears. Moving into the fantasy playoffs, and Romo Dunze, probably somebody that could get dropped in some leagues, did have 6 targets, does have 26 targets in 3 games with Thomas Brown, but 8.9 PPR points or less in 2 games in a row. Cole Kmet, another disappointing game as well. 7.2 PPR points or less in 2 of his last 3 games. So let's go to Detroit now, where I think we're kind of, I guess, just status quo on most of the stars. But Jahmyr Gibbs, this was his worst game of the season. Unfortunate fumble there, was headed into the end zone. Jared Goff's now scored 20.9 fantasy points in 4 home games in a row, and he gets 2 home games coming up against Green Bay and Buffalo in the next 2 weeks. So that's encouraging. Amon-Ra St. Brown does have his worst 2-game stretch of the season in his last 2 outings, but I don't think anybody's worried about him. Just take me through Heath, Jameson Williams, and Sam Laporta, because Jameson Williams, 7 targets, 5 catches in consecutive games with no touchdowns. And Laporta, one of the crazier stat lines that we'll see, 3 catches, 6 yards, and 2 scores.
So, yeah, I think this is what Laporta unfortunately is right now, is kind of a touchdown dependent borderline starter. And this game, he scored 2 touchdowns. And so hooray if you started him. I think Jameis is a boom bust wide receiver 3, and he busted this week, but he got 7 targets. He's got a 21% target share over the last month. If you're telling me a guy with his upside on every given play is seeing a 20% target share, I'm just going to keep starting him as a number 3. One thing I will say about Gibbs, and this wasn't just this game, I wonder if the carry disparity was because it was the revenge game for David Montgomery. Mm-hmm. But over the last month, Montgomery and Gibbs are tied with a 9% target share. Like the pass catching role for David Montgomery has increased recently and decreased for Gibbs, which isn't great for him.
Gibbs only had 2 carries in the second half, and he fumbled to end the first half. It's almost like the game kind of switched after that fumble. Like that gave the Bears the hope they needed to stay competitive, and they got into it. So I wonder if that was part of it. They also, between Montgomery and Gibbs, 10 carries in the second half. That's mind-boggling to me why they couldn't run those guys more.
Montgomery does have 3 catches in 3 games in a row, to your point, Heath. So he is getting more involved in the passing game, which has led to him scoring 15.4 PPR points in 3 games in a row. And it was his 3rd game this season without a touchdown. I do just yes or no. Laporta's got 5 touchdowns now in his last 7 games, scored 10 last year. Does he get back to 10 given what he's done lately?
Nope.
I'll say yes.
You'll say yes. So 1 yes, 1 no. It's nice to see him scoring. That's going to clearly boost his fantasy production. So
right, but I think that's all you can count on him for.
At this point, we did have some conversation on our pregame show yesterday that's the next evolution of this offense, is to get him going again. And if that's the case, red zone, not red zone, just giving him opportunities. He did have a questionable drop on a sideline route that was quickly overturned by replay. Had he caught that, his numbers look a little bit better. All right, Cowboys 27, Giants 20. I don't think anybody was surprised by the outcome, maybe surprised by how it unfolded. So we'll start with the Giants. Tommy DeVito did not start, out with a forearm injury, is potentially going to return to the starting role in week 14 as they get New Orleans. Drew Lock, Tyrone Tracy, both score rushing touchdowns. Malik Neighbors got his numbers back up. He loves playing the Cowboys. Dave, I'll give you the Giants. Any major takeaway there from what we saw in this game against Dallas?
Appreciate you giving me all the big time teams. Thank you for that. I was happy to see Tyrone Tracy lead the way in the backfield. We know how the last Giants game ended for him, and the game before that, actually. So the fact that he was able to, A, still see some high value touches, B, dominate playing time, and C, have a good stat line. It's an okay stat line. The rushing average wasn't great, but he scored. That's good. And so now maybe he's in that mix as a number 2 fantasy running back. Neighbors, high target volume again, not 15 PPR points again. Like, you got close to it, as close as you can get. He's fine to start as a number 2 receiver in full PPR. I'm very worried if he's even going to score another touchdown this year. So I think you got to knock down expectations even more in non-PPR. And those are really the only 2 guys I think I'd feel good about starting on the Giants.
Do think you could take a look at Theo Johnson in deeper leagues. He had 5 for 54 on 5 targets. This is now 4 games in a row, at least 5 targets and at least 10.4 PPR points in 2 of his last 4 games. So again, looking at all the teams on a bye next week, they get New Orleans, then they get Baltimore and then Atlanta. So Baltimore and Atlanta have struggled against tight ends if this continues. Yeah. Wan'Dale Robinson's probably droppable at this point, 9.7 PPR points or less in 5 of his last 6 games. Just for fun, for reference for next season, this is what Neighbors has done in 2 games against Dallas. 20 catches, 184 yards, no touchdowns, but 28 targets in those 2 games. So they like to feed him against the Cowboys. It was a little nerve-wracking with Tracy when Dylan Singletary started the game. But obviously Tracy getting the touchdown there. And look, Drew Lock should have had 2 rushing touchdowns. He lost 1 that led to Tracy's touchdown there. And just one note on defense for the Giants. Dexter Lawrence said he dislocated his elbow. That's obviously big. So it would be good news for both Taysom Hill and Alvin Kamara next week if Lawrence is not there, and Derek Carr if Lawrence can't play in week 14 as they take on New Orleans. Heath, Dallas, Rico Dowdle, huge game. CeeDee Lamb may have a shoulder injury. Nothing's been reported officially, but they did say during the broadcast that he was dealing with the shoulder injury again, which is why he was standing on the sideline. So, Cowboys.
He fell on the shoulder, grabbed it, walked over on the sideline, and was messing with it for the rest of the game. I don't know what the confusion was. I mean, they didn't report it for some reason. They didn't say that was the problem. I'm going to assume for now that because they didn't report it, because he didn't go to the locker room, it's just something he's going to have to deal with because the Cowboys won and they're technically still alive in the playoff race, that we're going to get CeeDee Lamb next week. And he's going to do what it takes to play. And I'm probably going to start CeeDee Lamb next week. Rico Dowdle was awesome. The Giants' run defense is abysmal. And there's 6 teams on a bye next week. So you're probably starting Rico Dowdle again. Great start to the game for Luke Schoonmaker. And then the Giants remembered that they knew how to cover tight ends. But he probably won't matter next week because Jake Ferguson should be back.
Schedule is fantastic for Dallas in the next 3 weeks. They get Cincinnati in week 14, Carolina in week 15, Tampa Bay in week 16. So don't rule out Cooper Rush maybe as a streaming option. I know it wasn't a pretty game, but he didn't have to do very much. For those of you that picked up and started the Cowboys DST, they came through 6 sacks, 2 turnovers, a pick 6, which was one of the more incredible plays that you could see. I'm not going to try and pronounce his name because I forget. Dave, what was the linebacker?
Overshown.
Yes, Overshown. Blew up Devin Singletary on the blitz pickup. Tipped the pass to himself and ran it in for a touchdown. Just absolutely incredible.
Overshown. My bad.
The one thing just to keep an eye on if CeeDee Lamb is out, Brandon Cooks returned first game since week 4 with a knee injury. Great touchdown catch. Great catch to seal the game on the 4th down play. 3 catches, 16 yards, but did get 7 targets. So he could be somebody of interest. Jalen Tolbert obviously did not have a big game, could be something of interest. And to your point, Heath, Schoonmaker 5 for 33 on 6 targets, all in the first 2 drives. And then nothing, absolutely nothing rest of the way. So we'll see what happens with the Cowboys. And for Rico Dowdle, first 100-yard game of his career, first 100-yard game for a Cowboy since week 3 of last season when Tony Pollard did it. So they've been struggling and looking for this type of performance lately. So again, good stretch of games coming up for Rico Dowdle. Not the best run defense to face with the Bengals next week, but then Carolina and Tampa Bay. So that could be good for him. All right, last game of the day. We had the Packers 30 and the Dolphins 17. Dave, I'll give you the winning team this time. Oh, yeah.
No, I just thought that we should have that graphic up while we talked about this game because it was the story of the game for the Dolphins.
Yeah, a lot of garbage time production there for those guys. But we'll start with the Packers side, Dave. So I'll give you Green Bay. I'm sorry. Well, I'll give Dave Green Bay. Dave, Heath, you can start with the Dolphins. The quote unquote worst team. Packers 30, Dolphins 17. Your biggest takeaway from the Dolphins?
The Jonnu Smith experience continues. He and Achane were the 2 guys who were good while this was a legitimate real football game. The Dolphins had 2 touchdown drives, both of them when they were down by 3 touchdowns. Maybe they got comfortable with the cold later in the game, and that's why they were okay. Tyreek, man, not just garbage time, but catches a ball deflected off of his tight end in garbage time. But if you started him, congratulations. That's fantastic. I think you're going to feel really good about Jonnu Smith as a top 5 tight end. I don't know what to make of Tua.
I think you're just starting Tua. I mean, look, the Jets, we know, have not been very good lately in terms of stopping anything. We'll see what Geno Smith and the Seahawks do against them. But this is now 3 games in a row with at least 29 fantasy points for Tua. Again, garbage time, but 365 and 2. So if you started him, you feel great about it. Achane's running has not been good lately, but his receiving has been fantastic. So 17 carries, 46 yards in his last 2 games, 11 catches, 80 yards, and 3 touchdowns on 13 targets in his last 2 games. Nobody's benching him. Do we go back to Raheem Mostert as the handcuff, or is it just a mystery because Jalen Wright didn't play and Mostert got his most work since week 9?
I mean, he should probably be rostered.
Mostert.
Yeah.
Roster Mostert.
Rostered Mostert. Jalen Waddle's 3rd game this season with 11.3 PPR points or more, but did have only 4 catches, 53 yards, and a 2-point conversion to get him over 10 fantasy points. And what Heath said, I mean, this is Jonnu Smith's numbers his last 3 games, 21.3 PPR points or more, and 30 targets in his last 3 games. He's just been fantastic. So must start tight end. All right, Dave, take us through the Packers. No Romeo Doubs in this game. He missed the game with a concussion.
And that really helped Jaden Reed get open near the end zone for a couple of touchdowns, 3 catches, 2 scores. That's right up there with Laporta. He just had a little bit more in the yardage department. And he also had a 23-yard carry. I still don't know why the Packers don't use Jaden Reed more. But, hey, it's good if you started him. I thought that most of us felt like he was a number 3 wide receiver. Maybe 1 or 2 of us had him as a low-end number 2. But this was a good opportunity for him to step up with Dobbs out. And he was great. I thought Jacobs would run like crazy. He did not. 2.3 yards per carry. Kind of saved a little bit by the touchdown and a 49-yard catch in the second half. He still looks good. I'm still going to view him as a top 5 type fantasy running back rest of season. And then Tucker Kraft. What did Kraft do last week?
He scored a touchdown against the Bears.
Okay. But like recently he had a donut game, didn't he?
Yes. 2 games prior to this game, he had no fantasy points. So this was his best game this season without scoring a touchdown.
Yes, yeah, and I think that's related to Dobbs too, Jamie. I think that Kraft.
I also think it's related to the Dolphins. So anytime you saw Trey McBride have a huge game against them. You saw Brock Bowers have a huge game against them. Like they just stink against tight ends lately, So I think if you're just talking about finding matchups, they get the Dolphins have the Jets next week. So I don't think anybody's starting Tyler Conklin. No. But after that, it's maybe Dalton Schultz, and then they get George Kittle in week 16. So probably nobody benefits.
Kittle will be awesome. And then so that means next week against the Lions, who do you feel good about in this Packers offense in that matchup? I think that's one where it could be a high scoring game. I think you're going to want pieces from both players.
I think you feel really good about the receivers if they're still all banged up in their secondary and their pass rush has not been the same since Aiden Hutchinson's been out in terms of the Lions. Tight ends are terrible against Detroit, so you don't want to trust Tucker Kraft. But I mean, at this point, like it's read or bust, right? In terms of trust, because at least he's giving you production.
I would guess
6 teams on a bye. Like Christian Watson's been a disaster. He's got no touchdowns since week 6.
He had those deep catches against Chicago, but really, I don't even know if he's done anything in the second half of the season.
He's got 3 games in a row with 4 targets or less. So he's just not getting. I mean, I guess the thing that you hope for is that Detroit is playing with a lead and they're playing catch up.
Which you should never put on a hot dog.
So we'll see what happens there with the Packers. But I'm curious to see how fantasy managers will treat Christian Watson going into
like a bye week receiver with upside.
But that's the thing. I mean, if we don't have bye weeks, you're not starting him next week. We do have bye weeks, and you might have to start him. So
sure,
it's one of those situations where he's just not been trustworthy.
And this is probably going to be one of those receivers where when we do the drop-o-meter, he'll be a 10. Yes. But it might be one more week before we actually put him at 10.
All right,
it's probably like 7 already.
We're going to take a quick break right here on Fantasy Football today. When we come back and get into the injuries, news, and notes, and the slate of games for the rest of the games for week number 13.
Historic rivals with unforgettable seasons meet in a game of honor. The Army-Navy game presented by USAA, December 14th on CBS.
All right, time for your injuries, news, and notes for week 13. First off, we have the game coming up later today between the Raiders and the Chiefs. Isaiah Pacheco is officially off IR. So, Heath, your thoughts on the backfield one more time as they take on the Raiders today?
They're both flexes. I'd prefer to start Hunt. I'd like it if I didn't have to start either one since we don't have anybody on a bye.
All right. And then Spencer Strader, the kicker for the Chiefs, is out, so Matthew Wright is going to kick. Very good matchup. I know Heath loves this stat, but the Raiders allow the most fantasy points to opposing kickers, so Wright may be a good streaming option if you are stuck trying to find a replacement. For the Raiders, Zamir White has been ruled out. Alexander Madison, we're waiting to find out on status. Dave, the backfield update for the Raiders is?
I would not want to start any of them. If you're desperate and Madison is active, I'd go back in that direction, but I wouldn't feel good about him nor Amir Abdullah. You could potentially, I should see who they play after this game. They're at Tampa next week. Okay, so maybe we can't say to just out and out drop Abdullah. You'll probably carry them through the game. Just hold on to them on your bench if you've got Madison and or Abdullah, but they might be droppable very soon.
Good matchup, though, against Tampa Bay and Madison.
Right. That's why you might want to hold on, especially Madison.
He's been startable at times this season. All right, quarterback news. Brock Purdy was limited again on Thursday. Trevor Lawrence limited again on Thursday. Heath, at this point, are we expecting either one of these guys to start?
We are currently ranking Lawrence, not Purdy, right? But Lawrence didn't even make my top 24, so I wouldn't count on either one.
It is a good matchup against Houston, but tough to trust because who knows how healthy he will be. It is his non-throwing shoulder that he's dealing with. Purdy is dealing with his throwing shoulder. Running back news. Breece Hall was upgraded from not practicing on Wednesday to limited on Thursday. We'll talk about that game as they take on Seattle on Sunday. Brian Robinson Jr. and Austin Eckler both still dealing with injuries. Robinson limited once again with his ankle injury. Eckler missed practice, still in the concussion protocol. We'll talk about the Washington backfield coming up, as well as the other side, which Tyjae Spears was practicing in full. So we are going to rank Tyjae Spears, and we'll see how that impacts Tony Pollard. Wide receiver news, we have DK Metcalf did not practice for the second day in a row. Tyler Lockett did not practice for the second day in a row. We'll talk about that game as well as they take on the Jets. Devontae Smith returned to practice but was limited, so trending in the right direction. So, Dave, if Smith does play as they take on the Ravens, how do you view him? And then how do you view maybe Dallas Goedert, who could be impacted by Smith coming back?
I would greatly lower the upside for Dallas Goedert. He would be a low-end fantasy tight end. The matchup's fine, but that's it. So he'd be close to 12 for me. And Devontae Smith would be like a low-end number 3 wide receiver. You're hoping that he can catch a couple of deep balls against that leaky Baltimore secondary.
Colts are dealing with injuries at their receiving core as well. Josh Downs, not expected to play, but still not practicing. Shane Steichen said it's a long shot for him to play this week against New England. Alec Pierce also did not practice on Thursday, so something to keep an eye on there. Could just mean more targets for Michael Pittman and maybe an upgrade for Adonai Mitchell. Cedric Tillman, it was their first practice on Thursday, still in the concussion protocol, so we'll see what happens as the Browns play the Broncos on Monday. Keon Coleman, limited for the second day in a row, so trending in the right direction. Heath, if Coleman plays this week against San Francisco, how do you feel about the Bills receiving core?
I will downgrade Khalil Shakir from a low-end wide receiver 2 to a mid wide receiver 3. Keon Coleman will be in that boom-bust touchdown-dependent flex range, probably around wide receiver 40. I'm not ranking Amari Cooper with or without Keon Coleman.
All right, so we'll see how that impacts that team taking on a banged-up San Francisco defense, which did not have Nick Bosa practicing on Thursday. Again, still dealing with that hip injury. Darnell Mooney practiced in full as they take on the Chargers. Dave, is Mooney just a must-start receiver at this point?
I think so. We've also seen him get some good downfield opportunities when Kirk Cousins is pressured. He's just trying to get the ball out as fast as he can, and he attacks downfield. That would be where I would expect Mooney to win this week against the Chargers. I would expect the Chargers to blitz him like crazy and to try and knock them down. That's what they've been doing. And that should lead to some decent opportunities for Darnell Mooney. So definitely a floor of a number 3 wide receiver, but he might be able to finish as a top 20 type guy.
All right. Tight end news. Dalton Kincaid did not practice on Thursday, so doesn't look good for him. Second day in a row that he's missed practice for the Bills coming off their bye. So it could be Dawson Knox if you are desperate for a tight end. Did have 4 for 40 last time we saw them in week 11. Will Disley was upgraded from not practicing on Wednesday to limited on Thursday. So trending in the right direction as they take on Atlanta. Low end starting tight end option. We know he's had some good moments lately, at least 8 or more PPR points in 5 of his last 6 games. And then Jatavion Sanders dealing with a neck injury, did not practice on Thursday. At this point, don't expect him to play, but he's only an option for fantasy managers in deeper leagues. Let me tell you about BetMGM before we go into the one question for each game. If you haven't signed up yet for BetMGM, use the bonus code FANTASY and you will get up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager with BetMGM. Here's how it works. Download the BetMGM app and sign up using bonus code FANTASY. That's FANTASY. Deposit at least $10 and place your first wager on any game. You'll receive up to $1,500 in bonus bets if your bet loses. Just make sure you use bonus code FANTASY when you sign up. All right, now time for one question for each game. Don't want to disappoint Adam and keep the same format that he likes to do. So we got Seattle at the Jets. Dave, if everybody is healthy, meaning DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, everybody for the Jets, who is the best wide receiver in this game?
So I have Garrett Wilson ranked the highest, but the heart wants to say Jackson Smith and Jigba. Just the way that he's been rolling, the fact that I still put a big question mark on whether or not the Seahawks will be able to run the ball. I think there's a correlation there between Kenneth Walker's struggles and Jackson Smith and Jigba's rise. And I do expect Garrett Wilson to get back involved in a big way in the Jets offense. So G-Dubs is first, JSN's right behind him.
Heath, same order?
I've got it JSN, Metcalf, and then Wilson.
I have JSN, Wilson, Metcalf. It's interesting, though, that we all have Devontae Adams fourth. And again, we'll get into more of the receiving core there.
How do you know that I've got Adams ahead of Lockett?
You have Adams ahead of Lockett, yes. So he would be fifth. Lockett would be fifth.
I do. Yes. No.
We just got to make sure that DK Metcalf's out there. So it's something to keep an eye on. Rams at New Orleans. So Heath, in a 4-point for passing touchdown leagues, who is the best super flex? Matthew Stafford, Derek Carr, or Taysom Hill?
I will still go with Matthew Stafford. He and Derek Carr project for around 15 fantasy points. Taysom Hill projects for around 11, but I definitely want to start Taysom Hill because he's a tight end, and I don't want to start the other two guys.
Can I just remind everybody that in Taysom Hill's last game, yes, 41 PPR points, amazing, ridiculous. The game before that, 7. So there's definitely a low floor here on Taysom Hill.
Go back to the game before that, because that's the one I think that we should hopefully.
In week 9, yeah, that was 16 PPR points, and that's not bad either. Like
7's not a low floor at tight end.
Moving forward,
7's not a low floor at tight end.
All right, we'll get into Taysom Hill in a second.
That's
all right,
true.
We got Tampa Bay at Carolina. Dave, who is the best running back in this game?
Ooh, I've got Chuba ranked the highest just because I know he's going to get every carry. I don't fear the matchup against Tampa. He's still going to continue to dominate those touches, even with Jonathan Brooks now in his second game. He's going to be first. Bucky Irving is second behind him, both top 20 fantasy running backs.
Yep, Chuba, then Bucky, both top 15 fantasy running backs.
I like Bucky better than Chuba, but to your point, Chuba is safer in terms of he's going to get the touches. So if you want to just go safest, I think it's Chuba. If you want to go, I think who has the highest upside, for me, it's Bucky Irving. Arizona at Minnesota. Heath, Marvin Harrison Jr. or Jordan Addison this week? Who do you like better?
I have Jordan Addison higher. They are both number 3 wide receivers, but and this could be a great game for Marvin Harrison because the Vikings see a lot of wide receiver targets. It's just that Marvin Harrison Jr. hasn't had a lot of targets since week 3.
That's a problem. And Addison's had at least 15 PPR points in each of his last 2, 3 of his last 4. I do worry a little bit about just how much passing the Vikings are going to have to do in this game. I think this is one where they might be able to give a big dose of the run, and that'll be enough for them to beat Arizona. So a little nervous about that, but I still think you have to view Addison as in the range of a number 3 wide receiver, even with nobody on bye this week. I do have Harrison ranked higher.
I would take Addison over Harrison, but I agree with Heath that they're both number 3 receivers. Not the best matchup for Addison, much better matchup for Harrison, but we'll see how that goes. Again, we'll break down the receivers for each team in a second. And then last game we have here for today's slate is Tennessee at Washington. Dave, who is the better flex in this game? Tony Pollard or Terry McLaurin?
McLaurin, because I don't believe in this Titans defense being as good as they were earlier in the year against the pass. I think Jaden Daniels started to click as a thrower in the second half last week, really more like the fourth quarter of last week. And I expect it to continue. I'd rather start McLaurin than Pollard.
So it was definitely Pollard when Tyjae Spears wasn't playing, at least for me. Now it's basically a coin flip, and McLaurin could go have an 80-yard touchdown, but there's that risk that he hasn't had more than 6 targets in a game since October, and they've played 4 games in November.
There's also risk with Pollard, though. Now that with Spears back, if Washington builds a lead, we've seen games in the second half where Pollard barely plays, and it's a whole lot of Tyjae Spears.
It's risky now. I mean, it's certainly risky with
it's
Spears
not
back.
like last week at all.
We will talk about that game coming up in a second. We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll dive into the games next here on FFT.
Welcome to JJ's.
I'll have a... Wait, there's no way I can get a burger?
No chance. But you can have the NFL on CBS streams live on Paramount+. Oh, hang on. There's a toy.
Seattle at Detroit. The over-under is 42 points. Seahawks coming off back-to-back wins. Jets are obviously struggling a little bit. Let's start with the Seahawks. Jonnu Smith, 2 games in a row with fewer than 16 fantasy points against the 49ers and the Cardinals. But 5 of the past 6 opposing quarterbacks against the Jets have been awesome, at least 19.9 PPR fantasy points or more. This is one of the more fun stats. I didn't do the stat of the game, so I apologize for that. But I'll start with this one.
Maybe you just gave it.
Quarterback has run for 59 yards or scored a rushing touchdown in 6 games in a row against the Jets. Smith has 2 rushing touchdowns in 3 games with at least 30 yards rushing this year. Is Jonnu Smith a starting fantasy quarterback in this week's game, Dave?
I've gone back and forth. I like a lot of quarterbacks this week. He ultimately ended up outside of my top 12. I think if you're stuck and he's on your bench, you could use him. I would start him over Will Levis. I would start him over Trevor Lawrence. I would start him over the other quarterback in this game. But I think that there's a little bit more upside for Stroud, given his matchup, Richardson, given his talent, Darnold, Stafford. Like, I think that there's more upside with those two than there is with Geno.
Doesn't 42 feel really low? And Seattle's only a 1-point favorite. Like the way the Jets defense has been playing over the last month, I'm not starting. Geno's a high-end QB2 for me, but it makes me a little bit nervous with like JSN and DK are both must starts and Ken Walker's must start. And we kind of like Jonnu Smith, and they've got an implied point total of 21.5.
It's weird.
Mm-hmm.
I guess maybe the thinking is they're on the road, and Jets coming off a bye. We'll see how that, changes some things for the Jets, hopefully in some way, shape, or form, mostly offensively. I like them to still be bad defensively. So you mentioned Kenneth Walker, Heath. It hasn't been great for him lately. 1 touchdown in his last 3 games to keep Adams YPC for life, 3.9 yards per carry or less in 4 games in a row. 13.9 PPR points or less in 3 games in a row. But 5 of the last 6 running backs against the Jets have scored at least 16.2 PPR points. So is this a big game for Ken Walker, or are we just going to get another, he'll grind his way to quality production?
I think it's probably more of the latter. Like I'm starting him. He's a borderline top 12 guy. I've got him projected for more than 13.9 fantasy points. So I don't think he's going to win you your week, probably. Just a good start.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's where he comes in full PPR. I think he'll be lower than that in non-PPR. If CJ Mosley's playing for the Jets, I feel a little bit better about the Jets' chances to slow him down. And we haven't seen great numbers. You mentioned it from Kenneth Walker. He hasn't had a big game since week 7. So I can't put my finger on why it is. It could be the line. It could be him. But I'm a little disappointed in what we've seen lately from Walker. To me, he's an RB2.
Okay, so hopefully he does what most running backs have done against the Jets. But like you guys have said, I agree. You're starting him as at least a number 2 running back for this week. All right, so the receivers for the Seahawks. So you got DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett, both not practicing for 2 days in a row. We'll see what happens on Friday. If Metcalf starts, you're starting him. If Lockett starts, you're avoiding him. But let's talk about Metcalf for a second. So 23.9 PPR points in his past 2 games. Not great. 11 catches, 129 yards, no touchdowns on 14 targets over that span. Technically, the Jets are number 1 in fewest fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers, but we know that hasn't necessarily held up over the course of the season when they do face elite receivers, and I think Metcalf is still elite. 3 wide receivers have scored at least 16.4 PPR points in their past 3 games against the Jets. But is he the number 1 guy? JSN has been awesome, 19.7 PPR points in 3 games in a row, and at least 7 targets in 4 games in a row. So who's the best receiver here, and do we like both, I guess, taking on this defense?
Back-to-back, both must starts. I've got JSN 1 spot higher, but I do think, like, you look at DK's biggest games, and he had 19.9 against the Falcons. They're pretty awful against wide receivers. He had 17 against the Lions. They're pretty awful against wide receivers. At least he had like 30 against the Patriots. We just saw how awful they are against wide receivers. He generally is the best guy against bad defenses. And again, this comes back to the over-under. Like, it doesn't set up as a game that this is a bad defense, but the Jets have been a bad defense for at least a month.
Are we sure that DK is all right? Because since the bye, Jamie, you said it, like 23.9 combined PPR points.
Well, he did miss 2 games with a knee injury.
Yeah, it's not just the bye. It's the the injury that he had. He missed 2 games before the bye. I remember he got carted off in that game in week 7, I think it was. And then still on the injury report. I haven't had a chance to really dig into his film lately, but I wonder if he's not running with the same explosiveness that we're used to. And that could be a good explanation for why he's not the top target getter over the last 2 weeks, why he hasn't had a bunch of splash plays over the last 2 weeks. It makes me a little nervous, and he's not in my top 24 among receivers, but JSN is. And we've seen this is another correlation. Maybe this is the correlation that we should be focusing on, is that Smith and Jigba, since the bye, since the injuries to DK Metcalf, he's the one that's come on.
It's not a bad theory. I do think I tend to lean more towards Heath, where both guys are worth starting this week, just given how the Jets have mostly struggled against good wide receivers. I do think JSN has become a must-start fantasy option at this point, and I still think Metcalf is a must-start fantasy wide receiver when it's not a horrible matchup where he's going to face somebody consistently that's going to shadow him, and I don't think that'll be the case with Sauce Gardner. And as we've seen, Gardner hasn't been the same type of cornerback that we're accustomed to seeing. So I still trust Metcalf as long as he's healthy. Just something to keep an eye on there. Tyler Lockett, you just can't trust him. He's got 4 targets or less than 4 games in a row, 3 catches or less than 4 games in a row, and 3 of his last 4 games he's been 20 yards or less. So even if Metcalf misses the game, you can't trust Tyler Lockett here at all. If anybody wants to trust Noah Fant, he did practice in full, but I don't think anybody's starting him at this point. Let's go to the Jets. So Aaron Rodgers, 20.1 fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 games, at least 20.1 fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 games. Has not thrown an interception since week 7, so he's done a good job in not turning the ball over. But here's what Seattle's done lately, and I wonder if their defense has turned the corner. So Kyler Murray and Brock Purdy combined for 444 passing yards, 1 touchdown, 2 interceptions in their past 2 games. And Seattle has given up 6 passing touchdowns with 6 interceptions in their past 5 games to Kirk Cousins, Josh Allen, Matthew Stafford, Brock Purdy, Kyler Murray. It's a pretty good group of quarterbacks. So is Aaron Rodgers worth trusting, given that he's been successful lately, just hasn't been great? And this matchup I don't think is fantastic, and Heath take into account the total points as well.
Yeah, he's a QB2. I was not excited about Tua. I have Rodgers and Tua in a couple of leagues. I started Tua. So that kind of tells you how I feel about Aaron Rodgers. I think he has the ability, like, it might be that he gets a garbage time touchdown and finishes with more than 20 fantasy points, but is not somebody that I want to trust. I'll still trust Adams and Wilson and probably whoever's playing running back, but not Rodgers.
I've got three quarterbacks rather that I think have more upside than Rodgers, and it's Levis, Lawrence, and Derek Carr. Just because of Carr's matchup against the Rams, could be a high-scoring game. You might have to throw a lot. I'd rather start those guys than Rodgers because it just feels like he doesn't have a lot of upside. And Seattle's defense, I think, has started to really turn the corner. You saw them really harass Kyler Murray last week. Made all the difference in the world. Their corners are starting to play better. Their pass rush is starting to get to the quarterback. Their run defense is getting stronger. I think there's a chance that they can travel to New Jersey and put a hurt on Aaron Rodgers. And they've been one of the most inconsistent. This is a compliment, Jamie. One of the most inconsistent defenses in terms of man versus zone. They can play both. And if Rodgers starts to beat them playing one way, they can shift to the other, and then maybe he's stymied after that. I kind of buy into the Seattle defense. I think it'll be troubling for Rodgers. And I think if you're banking on the wide receivers in this game, you're hoping for a lot of volume.
So you said you like Garrett Wilson the best of all the receivers in this game. He has not been good in his last 2 games against Arizona and Indianapolis. 9 for 59 on 14 targets. He did score at least 13.1 PPR points in each of his 5 games prior to that. Seattle's allowed 6 wide receivers score at least 18 PPR points in their past 5 games. So while they have done better against quarterbacks, receivers have put up numbers against them. And for Devontae Adams, it's been a struggle since he's joined the Jets, as we know. 1 touchdown in his 5 games with the Jets. 13.2 PPR points in only 2 games in those 5 games. But he does have at least 7 targets in every game with the Jets and 31 targets in his past 3 games. So if we're a little worried about Aaron Rodgers, should we be trusting these 2 guys given what they've not done really in the last several weeks, mostly Adams more so than Wilson, but Wilson with the 2 back games coming into this one.
Yeah, I'm thinking that Garrett Wilson starts to see targets shift his way. And Devontae Adams has been there for 5 games, and I know that he's BFFs with Aaron Rodgers, but he's just not getting it done. It's really been tough to watch. He's been playing in the slot a ton. Maybe he gets to around that 13 PPR point range. I think he's like at best a flex in full PPR. I think you can sit him in non-PPR. And I think Garrett Wilson just has a good opportunity to see a lot of targets and fall into good production. I think he's the best shot to score for the Jets too.
I think Keenan Allen's reminded us the last 2 weeks that volume over everything. Targets lead to fantasy points. I'm going to trust the targets with Devontae Adams. And he does have like 13.2, 9.1, 22.1 in his last 3 games. That's pretty great. He's a number 2 wide receiver for me. I'm starting both Wilson and I'm starting all 4 wide receivers in this game.
Where do you have Wilson in relation?
Like a spot or 2 higher.
Okay. So both in that low end number 2 wide receiver range or middle?
Mid.
All right, we'll see how it goes. Again, this defense has played better. If they can protect Rodgers, he should have a chance to connect with his wide receivers. But also, I think a big part of this is what's going to happen with the backfield, and that's clearly the biggest story, I think, with the Jets. So I buried the lead a little bit because Breece Hall did not practice on Wednesday coming off of a bye, was upgraded to limited, so is trending in the right direction. So if Breece Hall plays, this has not been a good matchup lately. The last 3 running backs against the Seahawks, Christian McCaffrey, Kyron Williams, James Conner, no touchdowns to those 3 guys. And only 3 running backs in the past 5 games have scored at least 14.6 PPR points, and those are 3 pretty good ones. So we have Breece Hall coming off of his best game of the season in Week 11 against the Colts, 31.1 PPR points. I'm assuming everybody's starting Breece Hall if he's healthy. Yep. I don't think that's a question. If he's out, though, do we trust Braylon Allen in a tough matchup? His numbers this season haven't been great in backup situations. He has 2 games this season with double digits in carries. Both of those were against New England. He scored 9.2 and 9.8 PPR points. His receiving totals on the season, 10 catches, 81 yards, and a touchdown. That's on 16 targets. And again, Mr. Razor, YPC for life, he's averaging 3.7 yards per carry on the season. So is Braylon Allen a starter if Breece Hall does not go?
Brian Robinson's kind of the cutoff for me of RB2s. He's at the end of the RB2s right now, and I think I'd probably put Braylon Allen 1 spot behind him.
How do you rank him versus somebody like Kareem Hunt?
Definitely, I would start Braylon Allen. Well, you can't make that. Like, you have to start.
Right. Like, we'd have to know before the, 90 minutes before
kickoff. We find out again. Let's just say Breece Hall, we find out before kickoff, was downgraded to.
Right. He doesn't practice on Friday.
No. But did not practice today.
Right. I mean, he could potentially be ruled out before kickoff of the game, and that makes it easier. But look, I'd probably put him right behind Kareem Hunt, and he'd be in that same range as the Raiders running backs, Rachaad White, Nick Chubb. Like, I'll start Braylon Allen without Breece Hall over all those guys.
Just make sure he's rostered right now because you don't want to get caught not having a chance to start him if he does start as at least a flex. He's 59% rostered on CBSSports.com leagues, so he's still out there in about 40% of leagues that you can just stash him. And if Breece Hall can't make it through this game, then you never know what happens moving forward. So something just to keep an eye on there. Keith, before we move on, any questions you see in the chat that apply to this game? I should have told you to do that beforehand.
Well, we've got Braylon Allen or Kamani Vidal. I think we'd all rather have Allen if Breece Hall's out, and
yes,
probably if he's not.
So pick up Braylon Allen now, and if we find out Breece Hall's fine, you can drop him and pick up Kamani Vidal, and then see how the Chargers use Vidal in the first game without J.K. Dobbins.
We do not have other questions about this game.
Okay. Next game is Rams-New Orleans. So if any questions come up for that game, you can shoot them over in the chat, and Heath will put them up for us as we go. We'll start with the Rams here. So the implied point total is 49.5, so a little bit more of a high-scoring affair expected here. Matthew Stafford, Kyron Williams, Puka Nacua, Cooper Kupp, they're all the 4 main options for the Rams. I don't think anybody's looking at the tight ends at this point, or Demarcus Robinson, who is expected to play despite his I think he had DUI, right? Traffic infraction this week. Yep. Something happened.
DUI,
alleged DUI earlier this week. So is expected to still play. All right. So Stafford is probably the only question mark here. So the Saints are number 9 in fewest fantasy points allowed to opposing quarterbacks. Stafford does have at least 21.9 fantasy points in 4 of his last 5 games. And 2 of the past 4 quarterbacks against New Orleans have scored at least 28.1 fantasy points. So Dave, is Matthew Stafford a starting fantasy quarterback this week?
I think he is. I think he's worth putting in there as a starter. Would put him in ahead of Richardson, Stroud, Geno. We talked about Geno. I would use him over Darnold too, and maybe even Bo Nix against Cleveland. Just thinking that there's a chance at a huge eruption here for him to have 3 touchdowns. We've seen him throw a ton. It's a little bit of garbage time luck last week to help Cooper Kupp out in the last minute or so of the game, but I think that this is definitely a spot where we're going to see Stafford throw the ball a lot against the Saints.
I think it's really going to depend on this Saints offense. And if they show up, then Stafford can be good. But like he's been good in 4 of his last 5 games. And one of those, he needed overtime to be good. And one of those, Dave mentioned, he needed garbage time chasing the score to be good. So I think they can run the ball. I think Kyron can have a lot of success against the Saints defense. And so if the Saints don't keep up, I think this could be one of those games where Stafford plays really well, but just doesn't have to do enough to be great. I agree with Dave that I would start him over Stroud. I would start him over Geno. I would actually start him over Kyler. I'd start him over Rodgers. Yes. I would have started him over Tua, but I'd like to take that back.
I would start him over Tua as well. I do think Stafford has in that 22, 23 point range again, which is kind of where he's been living outside of the Patriots game. Some of those opponents have been a little difficult as well. So to get the garbage time touchdown against the Eagles, that's something that to me was somewhat encouraging. Just that if you started him, you got a good number at the end of it. So you mentioned Kyron Williams having a big game running. We have not seen that from him lately. Yeah. He scored 11.2 PPR points or less in 4 games in a row. Did score a touchdown last week, but he's got no catches or targets in each of his last 2 games. But 4 running backs in their past 5 games against New Orleans have scored 16.8 PPR points or more. So it has been a good matchup. So Heath, you are expecting this to be a, I guess, breakout game for Kyron Williams or a slump busting?
I think he's a must start. I think he's right there with Ken Walker and Breece Hall as a must start number 1 running back. And I'm not even thinking about him.
You agree, Dave?
I think he's better than that. I agree he's a must start, but I think he's better than Kenneth Walker and Breece Hall.
All right, so you're counting on a big game for him also. So let's hope that that's the case. Again, everybody's starting Kyron Williams at this point unless your team is loaded, but it's just been frustrating to watch him not involved in the passing game, not scoring touchdowns. Had the fumble last week, which kind of limited, his production a little bit. So hopefully he takes advantage of the Saints defense like most running backs have in the last 5 weeks. Nothing really to say about Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp. I mean, they've just been awesome. So you're starting them.
Yep. No
questions. All right, let's go to the Saints now. So Dave mentioned Derek Carr as a potential option over Aaron Rodgers, at least. But he's been playing well of late, 22.7 fantasy points in his past 2 games. That's against Atlanta and Cleveland. And 3 of the past 5 quarterbacks against the Rams have scored 21.9 fantasy points or more. So, Dave, is he just really an option in super flex and 2 quarterback leagues, or would you consider starting him in 1 quarterback league?
No, I really wouldn't start him in 1 quarterback leagues because you know what the downside is. There's always the chance that he doesn't hit those deep throws to Marquez Valdez-Scantling or a catch and run to Taysom Hill or whatever kind of nonsense that he's been putting up in his last 2 games. That brings him back down to 15 or 16 fantasy points, which is what he scored in each of his 2 prior games before he had this little mini outburst that he's had with MVS. So I don't hate the matchup as far as the secondary goes. I don't think the Rams pass defense is particularly good, but the Rams pass rush is pretty good. Jared Verse has been awesome. That's going to be problematic for Derek Carr. I still don't know just how good that offensive line is at this point. Coming off the bye, it should be good, and that would help. But I almost feel like if Derek Carr, I think Derek Carr can have an okay game, Jamie. I think he can be like right around 18 fantasy points. I don't see him getting much higher than like 23, 24 fantasy points. So another one of those quarterbacks that doesn't have the sky-high ceiling. Stafford has the sky-high ceiling. Derek Carr, I don't think, has it.
You mentioned MVS, Heath, and he's been great, fantasy-wise. Obviously, it's a little tough to trust because he only has 7 targets in the last 2 games and 5 catches. But in those 7 targets and 5 catches, he's gone for 196 yards and 3 touchdowns. So not sustainable, but can you use him if needed as a boom-bust number 3 receiver? Do you like him in that? Do you like him to have a potentially good game here against the Rams?
I don't think anybody can predict MVS. He's a top 60 wide receiver for me. I maybe just barely cracked my top 48. No, he didn't. If I was going to search for one of those boom bust wide receivers, I'd prefer a Rashad Bateman. So listen, I'm starting Kamara. I'm starting Taysom Hill. Carr's a QB2. I don't really want to start anybody else.
Makes sense. I guess if you're behind in some way, shape, or form because you faced a couple of players from this week, nobody really had a huge, tremendous game. So let's say you're facing Laporta and Reed and
What if you were facing a Dolphins stack?
yeah, I guess let's say you're facing HN, Laporta, and Reed. Could be realistic. You want to, you're chasing points, then maybe MVS. But I think Heath is onto something there with Rashad Bateman or Nick Westbrook, Kine. These are all the same type of guys. So if you don't want to trust the lack of volume for MVS, just the touchdowns, then it's easier to say those guys are a little bit better. Kamara's been a must-start running back, should have another opportunity for a big game here. 7 running backs with at least 15.3 PPR points on the season against the Rams. Now, he has not scored a touchdown in 5 games in a row, so hopefully he does get in the end zone. But as we just saw, the Rams gave up a monstrous game to Saquon Barkley with 46.2 PPR points, so hopefully Alvin Kamara takes advantage of it. All right, let's talk about Taysom Hill a little bit more here. So, Dave, 41.5 PPR points, as you noted, in last week's last game for them against Cleveland. They were in a bye in week 12. That was with 7 carries, 138 yards, and 3 touchdowns, 8 catches, 50 yards on 10 targets. But I go back to that week 9 game. I just bring it up again because I think this is the type of touches that you're expecting here. So 5 carries, 19 yards. You want to see a little bit better rushing number there. 4 catches, 41 yards on 5 targets. So I'm figuring about 10 to 12 total touches for Taysom if things go right. This was, 15 total touches in the last game for him. That seems high. I don't think you can expect that. But I think 9 to 12 seems somewhat realistic. If he scores, you'll be thrilled. Again, scored against Carolina. So are we just banking on scoring a touchdown here? I know, Heath, as you said, 7 PPR points is not bad for a tight end, which is right. But we're not expecting that based on where we have him ranked. So, Dave, you start. Heath, you follow. Just your expectations, touches. What are we going to see from Taysom Hill?
You're definitely starting him ahead of over any streaming tight end. You're definitely starting him over any tight end that does have some downside. Just to name a few guys that have that: Ertz, Ingram, Disley. Like a good game for those guys at this point might be 11 or 12 PPR points. What you laid out, the type of touches that we could get from Taysom Hill, on top of the fact that not only might he score, he's their preferred option at the goal line. That's been what's hurting Alvin Kamara more than anything else lately. Yes, you're starting that. That's like a premier fantasy tight end. It's easier for me to name the tight ends that I would start ahead of Taysom Hill for this week. Kelsey, Bowers, Kittle, and I would have started Jonnu too, and Trey McBride in full PPR. Every other tight end, I'd sit for Taysom Hill.
Bowers, McBride, Kelsey, Kittle. Those are the only guys I'm starting over him. And if he has another game where he has a target share of even 20%, it was 34% in his last game. If he's over 20% target share and over 20% rush share, then he's the number 1 tight end the rest of the season.
Number 1. Wow. All right. So let's see if Taysom keeps it up. And also probably could depend on, Chris Olave if he's able to return from his concussion. Not expected to play this week. That's
kind of what's opened the door for him, is that the New Orleans ran out of good targets to throw to. And now he's emerged as their best target.
Yep. And if you're desperate, Jawan Johnson did score a touchdown in his last game, but hasn't done very much with it. So not somebody I think you want to rely on. All right, Tampa Bay, Carolina. Expected point total here is 46.5 for the Bucs. It feels like we kind of know what we're doing with them. Baker Mayfield's my start of the week. The running backs we'll talk about in a second. Mike Evans obviously is a must-start guy. Let's go to Cade Otton. So is Cade Otton going to bounce back after last week's disappointment? He got the Giants. As Heath said, in the second half, they remembered how to defend tight ends. They defended Otton very well last week. 1 catch for 30 yards on 3 targets. But that was the first game with Evans, so I understand why people might be a little bit concerned. So are we going right back to Cade Otton as a must-start tight end?
All season long, we've talked about how the Chiefs have given up the most fantasy points to tight ends. It's no longer the Chiefs giving up the most fantasy points to tight ends. It's the Panthers. I'm going to give Cade Otton 1 more week as a starter. Not a must-start. I think I've got him 9th. But a top 12 tight end this week. If it's another 10% target share game, then we're probably looking for a streamer. But start Cade Otton.
I do wrestle with how many targets he could have if the Bucs running backs, mainly Bucky, is going to continue to take a lot of work away from everybody else in the passing game. I think that's one of the things that, obviously having Mike Evans come back last week, that hurt Cade Otton. But if the running backs are going to continue to get these short area targets, those are short area targets that are not going to Otton. But I'm in the same boat as Heath here. I think that he's deserving of another week, at least 8.5 half PPR points to a tight end. Carolina's allowed in 5 of their past 6. Noah Gray had 2 touchdowns last week. They can scheme up Cade Otton to get open in the end zone. So he's in that touchdown or bust range of tight end. Taysom Hill, an easy start over him.
Carolina's allowed 7 touchdowns to tight ends in the last 5 games, and 5 tight ends have scored at least 12.2 PPR points against Carolina over that span. Just real quick, Mike Evans' last 5 games against Carolina, 35 catches, 576 yards, and 6 touchdowns, at least 18.6 PPR points in 4 of those games. So hopefully he gets going after a disappointing stat line last week. Let's talk about the running backs here. So all 3 scored a touchdown last week. I don't think you have to worry about Sean Tucker because he only played 8% of the snaps, but may fall into the end zone to ruin one of the other 2 guys. It's really about Bucky Irving and Rachaad White. So Keith, give me the breakdown of Bucky and Rachaad White. Both were good last week. Bucky Irving was obviously amazing.
Bucky is a good number 2 running back, and if he continues to see 75% of the running back targets like he did last week in the first game off the bye, then I think we view Bucky as a number 1 running back rest of season. But right now, I'm still viewing him as a good number 2. And again, we've talked about this before. Like when things change positively for rookies after the bye, a lot of times those things stick. So if he's getting 3/4 of the running back targets, he's an absolute league winner. I've dropped Rachaad White outside of my top 24 running backs. I'd still start him in full PPR over Gus and Javonte and Jalen Warren and Nick Chubb. I'd start him over Kareem Hunt and Tank Bigsby, but he's not a top 24 running back. I would rather start Najee Harris and Ramondre, and I don't really even like those guys.
I'd have to go back and see. I think Rachaad White only had more carries than Bucky in the 4th quarter. Like I almost feel like he's kind of had some garbage time last week, and that's what helped.
Same amount of carries. They both had 12 carries last week.
Right, but I think most of them came in the 4th quarter. In the first 3 quarters, it was the Bucky show. So that makes me a little nervous. I've got White as a number 3 running back as well. Most of the running backs that Heath named, I agree, I'd start White over them, but I don't feel particularly confident in Rachaad White. Certainly not where I was a week ago by comparison. Bucky's the guy in that backfield.
Not only is Carolina number 1 in most fantasy points allowed to opposing tight ends, they're number 1 in most fantasy points allowed to opposing running backs. So it could be good for both of them. But I think, yes, Rachaad White better off as a flex. All right, the Panthers, there's not really a must-start player aside from Chuba Hubbard. And what we saw from him last week, 89% of the snaps in the first game with Jonathan Brooks. So I don't think you have to worry about Brooks. Tampa Bay, number 7 in most fantasy points allowed to opposing running backs. Is Hubbard just the slam dunk number 2, maybe number 1 running back this week?
Borderline top 12 for me. I'm starting Chuba Hubbard everywhere.
At least 15 PPR points each of his last 3 games. 2 of those games over 20. I don't see how you get away from him.
Pick your favorite Panthers receiver, Dave. You got Xavier Legette, you got Adam Thielen, you got David Morey. Those are your 3 choices.
We're back to the fun questions. Thanks, Jamie. It's Legette, but it's not by much, and I'm not starting any of these guys with any semblance of confidence. I guess I would I can't even look at them as like scouting options for bye week action. They play Philadelphia next week. So I don't see a good reason for carrying any of these guys on a redraft roster.
I'm a little bit more optimistic about, I'm hopeful you don't have to start him, but we've got 12 and 14 team leagues where you start 3 wide receivers in a flex or 3 wide receivers and 2 flexes. And Legate's had at least 6 targets in 3 of his last 4 games. I thought Bryce Young looked pretty good playing against a Chiefs defense that's much better than this Tampa Bay pass defense. So I'd rather start Legate than those boomer bust dart throws we were talking about, MVS and Bateman and those guys. I think he's at wide receiver 40-ish for me.
To me, he's the touchdown or bust fantasy tight end that doesn't get a lot of deep throws. Those other wide receivers are touchdown or bust tight ends or tight end. I don't know why I'm saying tight ends. Wide receivers. Maybe it's because Legate's kind of like a tight end. Legate or those other receivers are boom bust wide receivers who have a chance at scoring. Westbrook-Ikine, as an example, gets about the same type of target volume as Legate, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, he does have 6 targets in 2 or 3 games with 11.
Right. I'd rather start him. I'd probably just spin the wheel on MVS over Legate as well.
If you think he's going to score, he did score in 2 of his a touchdown in 3 of his past 4 games prior to his last 2, and that's with Thielen coming back last week. It is a good matchup, though, because Tampa Bay is number 7 in most fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers. So if you're banking on matchups, maybe it helps Legette more so than some of those other guys, but it is not necessarily a good week to trust them. And for Adam Thielen, we got a few questions in the chat that I see here. He did not have a great game last week. 3 catches, 57 yards on 4 targets. That was his first game back since week 3, excuse me. and not a good history against Tampa Bay, who was better defensively against receivers last year than they are this year, not by much. But he had 5 catches for 37 yards combined in 2 games against Tampa Bay last season. That's on 9 targets. So not a good history there if you're talking about that. I guess the one thing to keep an eye on is in deeper leagues, if David Moore has another good game, he had 6 for 81 and a touchdown on 10 targets. So whenever you see a spike in targets like that, something just to keep an eye on. Again, I don't think many people are going to start him, but with all the teams on a bye next week, to Heath's point, 12-team leagues, 14-team leagues, 16-team leagues, he might be of interest to you. He's available in over 90% of leagues.
And he's
now to, before we go
his
next,
out rate's been high for several weeks now. So
let's take our last break here. I'm sorry, we're going to go over an hour slightly, and then we'll wrap up the last 2 games here on Fantasy Football Today.
CBS Sports HQ, giving you college football coverage unlike anyone else.
We're talking Big Ten.
Pre- and post-game coverage.
Are you encouraged with the way that this team responded?
Along with breaking news.
A lot of movement in the rankings this week.
Highlights and expert analysis.
That streak could be in jeopardy here.
Sure. What was your main takeaway from this game? How impressive was his domination?
That really changed the football game.
Let's go ahead and have some more fun.
Another wild ending.
The chaos continues.
Turn to CBS Sports HQ.
Arizona and Minnesota, the expected point total here is 45 points. We'll start with the Cardinals here. So, Dave, you mentioned you don't like Kyler Murray. Heath, I think you said the same thing. It's tough to trust coming off a game with 10.3 fantasy points last week against Seattle. It's the second time in 3 games he scored 10.3 points or less, 16.2 fantasy points or less in 3 of 5 road games this season. So, again, going on the road hasn't been good for him. Vikings number 3 in fewest fantasy points allowed to opposing quarterbacks. Only 4 quarterbacks this season over 20 fantasy points. So, Dave, make the case for Kyler Murray because it doesn't sound like this is a good setup for him.
I've got to make the case for Kyler Murray?
Yes.
Okay, so let's see if I can do this here. All right.
It's the game of the week. Yeah, no.
I hope it's not. Maybe Adam thinks so. Maybe you think so. But I'm
a fun game. I mean, you got 2 playoff contenders.
Sure, it could be a good game, but I'm worried about the direction of the Cardinals' offense. I really did not like what they showed us last week against Seattle, and this Vikings defense is going to be all over Kyler Murray. His offensive line was terrible last week. So they need to get better there first and foremost. But you know what the Vikings do. They're going to blitz. They're going to play a lot of zone behind. It's going to really temper any type of big plays that Kyler can have. This is a team that doesn't want to throw the ball a ton anyway. They might have to in this game. And Kyler Murray just makes me nervous. I know the whole story about how the Vikings allow a ton of fantasy points to wide receivers. It's literally the only thing that makes Marvin Harrison a palatable starter. I think Kyler's going to struggle again, and I think he's going to get hit a lot, and I think the Vikings are going to dominate time of possession and have another big win against the Cardinals, who are on the road 2nd week in a row. This is Kyler Murray. This is a tough spot to trust Kyler Murray.
I can make the case for Kyler Murray because Dave, that was a really bad job of making the case for.
Well, I can't do it.
All you did was say bad things about Kyler Murray,
right? Because
the case for Kyler Murray is that the direction of the Cardinals' offense has not been predictive at all this season. Every time he's really good, he goes really bad. And every time he's really bad, he goes really good. He throws for 300 yards and 2 touchdowns against the Dolphins. And then he's absolutely awful, 160 total yards against the Bears. And then he has 3 touchdowns against the Jets. And then he's absolutely awful against the Seahawks. Kyler Murray is like, he has huge upside any given week, and he might score you 6 to 10 points. I don't like him, but the case is that nothing he's done this season has been predictive of what's coming.
The one thing that I really hate about this, because you're right, Heath, it's been a roller coaster where we just don't know when the good games are going to show up for the most part. This team, Minnesota, number 1 in fewest rushing yards allowed to opposing quarterbacks. So the thing that saves him, like the San Francisco game, for example, he had the big rushing touchdown there to save him. It's probably not going to happen. And 1 rushing touchdown allowed to quarterbacks this year. So if they contain his rushing totals, to expect him to do it from a passing perspective, which has not necessarily been what's helped his best performances, aside from maybe that Dolphins game, we just have not seen that consistently. So I think it's easy to sit him in 1 quarterback leagues. Now, James Conner has not been playing great as well lately. Certainly last week, 9.9 PPR points against the Seahawks, which was with a season low 8 rushing yards. Now he does have back-to-back games with 5 targets and 5 catches. So that's been helpful. I'm sorry, he hasn't been running well. Like, he's been playing well, but his passing game production has been good. Minnesota's number 3 in fewest fantasy points allowed to opposing running backs. In the last 3 games, it's been Jonathan Taylor, Travis Etienne, DeAndre Swift, 9.5 PPR points or less. So is Conner a safe start, Keith? Do we like him this week?
I wouldn't call him a safe start. I think I've had him, like, when I like him, he's usually a top 12 guy. He's still a top 24 guy. And we have seen some running backs have success against the Vikings through the air. I think they're like 8th in terms of total targets seen to running backs at 6.5 per game, giving up 4.5 catches to the position. So in full PPR, I think Connor's still a start as a number 2 running back, borderline and none.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I'm worried about the offensive line holding up. I think the matchup's going to be really, really hard for him. I would not expect 15 PPR points from James Conner.
Got to score a touchdown for that to happen, especially if he's still getting the work in the passing game. But, just the running totals have not been there for him, at least certainly last week with only 8 yards rushing. Trey McBride's a must-start tight end. Still no receiving touchdowns on the season, which is incredible. But you're going to start him no matter what. He's just been awesome. 10.1 PPR points in 7 games in a row, 3 games over 17.6 PPR points over that span. Let's talk about Marvin Harrison. So the matchup's great. The Vikings are number 2 in most fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers. You mentioned it, though, Heath. The targets have not been there for him. 6 targets or less in each of his last 3 games. 7.7 PPR points or less in 2 of those past 3 games. But 7 wide receivers scored at least 12 PPR points against Minnesota in just the last 5 games alone. So just a number 3 receiver, or any faith in maybe this is kind of a breakout game?
I shouldn't say this, but it's true. He's a rich man's MVS.
Wow.
And much, much better. I said a rich man's, but there's no guarantee of volume at all. He has 2, 5, and 3 catches in his last 3 games. If you wanted to look at something that's like, well, this is positive, is that it has been like Kyler in every other week thing. He had 5 fantasy points and then he had 23. He had 5 fantasy points and then he had 16. He had 7 fantasy points. I guess he's due for a 20-point game based on the Arizona Cardinals roller coaster. But you're just hoping he catches a long touchdown, I think.
Could happen, but yeah, it's tough to say must start. So starter in 3 receiver leagues, a guy you can avoid in 2 receiver leagues. So let's go to the Viking side of things here. So Sam Darnold, 22.2 fantasy points in 4 of his last 5 games. But it has not been good for this team, for teams facing the Cardinals. So Justin Herbert, Tua Tagovailoa, Caleb Williams, Aaron Rodgers, Jonnu Smith, 16.7 fantasy points or less in 5 games in a row against Arizona. So their defense has been playing great. And only 3 quarterbacks this season have gone over 20 fantasy points against them. That was Josh Allen, Jaden Daniels, and Jordan Love. And that was earlier in the season for the most part. So is Sam Darnold a good start this week based on what we saw? And, Dave, you and I argued about this against Chicago, who had been very good against quarterbacks, and he came through with a strong performance. So are you going to make the case for Sam Darnold in this one, or are you opposed to Sam Darnold this week?
He's sitting on the fence at 12 for me in my quarterback rankings. I've seen this Cardinals pass rush come alive over their last couple of games. I'm curious if they're going to actually play their rookie first-round pass rusher, Robinson. Is this going to be the week? And anytime Darnold's pressured, I think it leads to some trouble. And I also don't know how much throwing he's going to have to do in this game. So I think the pass attempts will be down. I think the yardage might be down a little bit, but I can't rule out 2 touchdowns. And he's got the receivers. And we talked earlier on this show about Jordan Addison and how good he's been in 3 of his past 4 games. He can help make Sam Darnold's stats passable, which I think we could say was the case last week and could certainly happen again this week. And then there's that other wide receiver they have, Jalen Naylor. Yeah, him. And a tight end, Hawkinson. Is there anybody else they've got who's any good that might be able to?
Not lately.
He had a 40-yard touchdown called back last week, Justin Jefferson did. So if he scores that, no one's really freaking out about him. He's not a number 1 overall. He's not like a 101 wide receiver anymore, but he's certainly going to be a must-start guy. And the point is that with all these targets, Sam Darnold, even without huge passing volume, should be able to have a good game. Let's emphasize the word good. 20 to 22 fantasy points in that range. I would bet on that for Darnold this week.
You said 3 quarterbacks who have been good against the Cardinals. It was Josh Allen, it was Jaden Daniels, it was Jordan Love. There are 3 quarterbacks with more than 20 fantasy points against the Bears. It's Jaden Daniels, it's Jordan Love, and it's Sam Darnold last week. He's a borderline QB1.
Fair to say. It's not been good for quarterbacks for the most part against this team, but yes, he's been fantastic, and hopefully Justin Jefferson does get going. 9.8 PPR points or less in 2 of his last 3 games. coming off the season low, 4.7 PPR points against Chicago. You wonder if there's a squeaky wheel game coming, but he has not scored a touchdown since week 7. So we need to see a little bit more from Justin Jefferson. Nobody's sitting him, but we just want more production. Jordan Addison, we talked about again, high-end number 3 receiver, just based on the matchup. 3 receivers have scored at least 13.2 PPR points against Arizona in their last 5 games. So they have been good against opposing wide receivers, but feels like there's a little bit of momentum building for Addison, who's been good the last 2 weeks. Are we starting TJ Hawkinson? Because he's coming off a good game, but he's been similar to Kyler Murray, up and down. 2 good games, 2 bad games in the 4 games that he's come back. No touchdowns yet, but did have 7 for 114 on 9 targets against the Bears last week. So Heath, is he a starting tight end?
He is a top 12 tight end for me. I would still start, obviously Taysom. I would still start Cade Otton over him. I'd still start Hunter Henry over him. But I would start Hawkinson over Goddard. I'd start him over Ertz. I'd start him over Andrews. So he's kind of like Sam Darnold, like right at that borderline of the top 12. If I've got him on my team, I'm probably not going and looking for someone else.
And I probably have him ranked a little too high. I've got him 9th among tight ends. I don't think he'll have the same type of volume as he had last week. Probably by the time you get to my rankings, he'll be closer to 12.
Aaron Jones coming off one of his best games of the season, best game since week 7, first touchdown since week 7, 22 for 106 and a score, 3 catches, 23 yards on 4 targets. Arizona's not very they are actually good in terms of you can throw against them. So number 11 in most receptions allowed to running backs. 5 running backs in the last 4 games against Arizona scored at least 12.3 PPR points. So I'll just use the James Conner baseline. Better than James Conner?
I've got him just behind Conner.
Behind Conner.
I think they're kind of the same guy. They're both mid RB2s.
Dave?
Yeah, if we're talking about Aaron Jones?
Aaron Jones versus James Conner.
Jones by a mile.
Jones by a mile for you. Okay.
Yeah, he's the number 1 running back for me this week.
Okay. I like Jones better than Conner. He's not a number 1 running back for me, but I do think that this is an opportunity for him. And you've just kind of laid out the narrative, Dave. You think it's going to be a lot of running for the Vikings. So could be a good game for Aaron Jones. All right. Last game that we're looking at here is Tennessee at Washington. 44.5 is the over under here. So Will Levis, Dave mentioned it's coming off of, a couple of strong performances, 20.1 fantasy points in 2 of his last 3 games. Washington, number 11 in most fantasy points allowed to opposing quarterbacks, and 3 of the last 4 quarterbacks against Washington, 21.7 fantasy points. And that's the stellar trio of Daniel Jones, Russell Wilson, and Cooper Rush. So there is an opportunity here for Will Levis. I don't think anybody's starting him in 1 quarterback leagues, but the schedule coming up is very favorable for the Titans. And so if you want to get ahead of it, stash him on your bench. If he has another good game, get Jacksonville next week. You probably want to start him in that matchup. So not a bad streaming option moving forward if Will Levis can sort of avoid the mistakes. But again, super flex 2 quarterback leagues. I don't mind him for this week. Let's go back to just the Titans running back situation here. So Tony Pollard, good last week, but that was without Tyjae Spears. Bad the 2 weeks prior with Spears playing. Spears cleared the concussion protocol, or I'm sorry, at least practicing in full. Expected to clear the concussion protocol. Is Tony Pollard still a safe start? And compare him to, I guess I'll stick with you, Heath. Compare him to Aaron Jones and James Conner with Spears playing.
I will move him behind Jones and Conner when we get done with this show, because we're going to add Spears to the rankings. I will leave him ahead of Brian Robinson. They're both going to be low-end number 2 running backs. So any of those guys like Najee or Ramondre or Kareem Hunt that we don't really want to start, I think you start Pollard over. Anybody you've got that you feel like is an RB2, you start him over both the running backs in this game.
Dave, how do we feel about Calvin Ridley? Because he's only got 2 games with a touchdown. He did have a 2-touchdown game, but 2 games with a touchdown. 12.3 PPR points in 4 of his last 5 games, at least 6 targets in 7 games in a row. Now, Washington could get Marshawn Lattimore playing for the first time this season. He's been limited in practice, dealing with the hamstring injury. Yep. And only 3 wide receivers have scored at least 14.9 PPR points against Washington in the last 4 games. So is this a safe matchup for Ridley?
I'm starting him as a number 2 wide receiver. Just the boom bust nature of his game combined with the high volume that he's been getting is what keeps me going with Calvin Ridley and why I still want to trust him.
And for Nick Westbrook-Akine, scored a touchdown in 6 of his past 7 games. He does have 11 targets in the last 2 games with Will Levis, with 4 catches for 165 yards and those 2 touchdowns. And he scored at least 12.8 PPR points in 3 of his last 4 games. But as we've kind of noted, it's like MVS. It's like Rashad Bateman. It's big play or bust, which has kind of been saving Westbrook-Akine. So take that into account against a matchup that's not exactly the easiest. But again, if you are desperate, could be a boom bust number 3 wide receiver. For Washington, Jane Daniels, he ended his 2-game slump last week against Dallas with 34.4 fantasy points. He ran for 74 yards and a touchdown. The previous 2 games against Pittsburgh and Philadelphia combined for only 23 rushing yards. It was his first rushing touchdown since week 4, but Tennessee has allowed a rushing touchdown to a quarterback in 2 of their last 3 games. I think everybody's starting him. Is there anybody that is it any concern about Daniels? That last week was just the hectic comeback against Dallas that sort of saved him. He got the 86-yard touchdown from Terry McLaurin with 21 seconds to go, but did run better. Is he back to being Jane Daniels again?
I'd start Baker over him. I'd start Mahomes over him. I've got just a touch of concern, but he has way too much upside to sit.
Agreed.
Okay, touch of
it's
concern.
as simple as that. And you've got to be encouraged by the rushing and just the aggressive passing that we saw last week.
Terry McLaurin's a must-start wide receiver. Again, just been mostly consistent in terms of his fantasy points. He did get lucky a little bit last week with the 86-yard touchdown with 21 seconds to go. But that is now 13.4 PPR points in 9 of his last 10 games. So just delivering week in, week out, some way, somehow. Does have 6 targets or less in 4 games in a row, and has actually been out-targeted 27-17 by Noah Brown in the last 4 games, but nobody's benching Terry McLaurin. Zach Ertz, is he a safe start at this point? 14 PPR points in 4 of his last 6 games, 2 in a row, hitting that number, 7 targets in 3 consecutive outings. Does he become a slam dunk tight end at this point?
I wouldn't go to the point of slam dunk tight end. I think I've got him right behind Hawkinson, so I would definitely call him a borderline tight end 1. The Titans have been very good against tight ends. They did give up a touchdown to Cade Stover last week, but they've given up touchdowns to the Lions tight ends. Sam Laporta and Brock Wright both scored 1 in week 8, and Cade Stover scored 1 last week, and no other tight end has scored a touchdown against them this year.
How many good tight ends have they taken on? Not saying that Zach Ertz is like
of the Zach Ertz level. I mean,
you mentioned some just now.
Yeah. I don't remember.
So here's the thing. They've allowed 4 tight ends to score at least 8 PPR points in their last 5 games, 3 touchdowns over that span. The one thing that I think you look at, if you take away the name, so just we're not talking about Zach Ertz, we're talking about a tight end that's gotten 7 targets in 3, at least 7 targets in 3 games in a row. Okay. 14 PPR points, 4 of his last 6 games. Like, the numbers are impressive.
That's good. You're starting that guy. That's it.
Okay, so low end starter. Let's just call it that. All right, let's talk about the backfield. We'll wrap up the show with this. So Brian Robinson limited the past 2 days with the ankle injury. Austin Eckler still in the concussion protocol, not expected to play. It's not an easy matchup. What we've seen from Tennessee the last 3 games, J.K. Dobbins, healthy at that point, clearly. Aaron Jones, Joe Mixon. Mixon was coming off an amazing stretch of games. All 3 held to 9.5 PPR points or less. So Tennessee's faced 3 really good running backs, shut them all down. Robinson's been very good for the majority of the season, 13.1 PPR points in 6 of 8 games. The one game that Eckler did miss this season, which was week 4 against Arizona, it was the best game for Brian Robinson, 20.3 PPR points, 3 catches for 12 yards. That's the last time he had more than 1 catch in a game, but he had 21 carries, 101 yards, and a touchdown. So as Brian Robinson Jr., Heath, you've been saying number 2 running back. For me, he's a flex. I don't want to trust him this week, even with Eckler most likely out, because I don't think he's 100%, and you're facing a really good defense. But you seem a little bit more optimistic.
I mean, he is the cutoff for me of a number 2 in a flex. He's right around RB24. I don't feel particularly good about him. It's does he score a touchdown is basically the way that he turns into a number 2 running back. He's done that more often than not this season. And so I think you probably get 3 catches, which definitely helps him more than a week when Eckler is playing. RB24 is the perfect spot for him.
Yep. It's right around where I have him. Low end number 2 running back.
Okay. Just outside that for me, but hopefully he gets a little bit more work in the pass. I just hope he's healthy. That's the concern. And if he does, for whatever, miss the game, Jeremy McNichols, 60% rostered right now. Does McNichols get any work in the passing game? That's not his profile. He only has 2 catches on 3 targets this season, but someone may have to step up without Eckler there if it's not just Brian Robinson taking all of that work. So how do we feel about McNichols, Dave, with Robinson and without Robinson?
Well, I think it's pretty obvious. Without Robinson, he's somebody who's going to be able to maybe fill in as an emergency RB replacement. If I weighed him versus Braylon Allen minus Breece Hall, I'd rather have Allen than McNichols, but he'd be close behind. So kind of in that range, he'd be a number 3 type of fantasy running back, and you'd hope that he'd find the end zone against Tennessee. obviously, if there is Robinson, then I almost think you're wishing for garbage time production.
Last time Eckler missed, he scored 20.4 fantasy points, scored 2 touchdowns, 68 rushing yards, only caught 1 pass. I do want to say, like, there was a time where he was the pass catching back for the Titans, had 38 targets in 14 games for them in 2021. So he has been the third down pass catching back before. He just didn't serve in that role when Eckler missed time earlier this year.
Yeah, it's a different coaching staff, and I don't know how they view him compared to Ron Rivera's staff back in that time. Hopefully Robinson's fine, and
that was the Titans.
We don't see a whole lot of him, of McNichols.
It was the Titans, not the Panthers.
Yeah. Todd Downing. He was the offensive coordinator of that team.
That'll do it for us. Again, 1 hour and 20 minutes. Adam Major's going to kill me. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Hopefully, everybody had a good Thanksgiving Day. We'll have you updated on everything, and we'll answer more of your questions. We don't have a mailbag this week because Adam's traveling, but we will be back Sunday at 11:30 a.m. Eastern here on YouTube. You can check us out, CBS Sports HQ, as well at 10 a.m. Eastern. Check out everything we have going on the site, cbssports.com, where you'll get a lot more start, sit, all the columns that we have to offer, all the player updates as well. For Heath Cummings, for Dave Richard, I'm Jamie Eisenberg, our producer Claire as well. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. This is Fantasy Football Today.